Hello everyone, I'm Nayaswami Asha and we're continuing with our class on the essence of the Bhagavad Gita explained by Paramhansa Yogananda as remembered by his disciple Swami Kriyananda. A really beautiful book, and we are up to chapter 2 verse 48, but we're actually going to go back a little bit to chapter 2 verse 46, which reads like this. To the knower of Brahman, the Supreme Spirit, the Vedas are of no more use than a well when the land all around is in flood. And we've actually taken a bit of a tangent from that verse directly, although of course that's what makes the Gita so powerful, is that you can take these endless tangents and you're still pulling the truth off of the Gita. And in the commentary, Swamiji had taken the time to say something that Master had spoken about the Vedas, and we dealt with this at great length in class number 12 and also a little bit in class number 13 last week. But I received a question which I feel is necessary to answer. The essence of Swamiji's reports of Master's words about what another meaning of that verse about the Vedas is the role of ritual and kind of directed formal spiritual practice for the attainment of a certain end. And in brief, what Master explains there is that the Vedas came from a very high age, but they were actually written as that age began to decline, even though it was still an age far more advanced than the age we're in now. But life had transitioned as Satya Yuga began to end, descending, Satya Yuga descending, and Treta Yuga descending began. Prior to that, no rituals were necessary because mankind was so instinctively in tune with all of creation that the relationship did not have to be formalized. And as the consciousness of the planet and the individuals dwelling here began to shrink, where perception was not automatic, then that which had been universally shared suddenly had to be explained, and a certain amount of directed energy, now energy had to be consciously and specifically directed toward maintaining a planetary harmony, whereas in the highest age that harmony was simply automatic. So what Krishna is also implying here, because Krishna came at the end of Dwapara and the beginning of Kali, descending, is that even though the very definition of spirituality at this time is the adherence to these rituals and the understanding of the necessity to be in right relationship to creation, and the subtlety of the rituals and the prayers and the mantras and the right pronunciation of the Sanskrit words because of the vibratory relationship between the sounds that the priests are articulating and the actual vibrations of reality that we're trying to harmonize. All of that is true. But Krishna wants us to understand that it's not an end in itself. And so he uses the example of the enlightened sage, but Master said that there was even a more subtle message implied there, and that was that now, well, Krishna was writing for all times, but he was still, all of Kali Yuga had to descend, and then Kali Yuga had to start rising again. And in 1900, we shifted over to Dwapara. I know in India this is not the common understanding, but I believe in class 12 I dealt with this at great length. And I'm talking now about the correction that Sri Yukteswar, and then Master after him, gave to what they say is a misunderstanding that came in during Kali Yuga. So I'm not going to reiterate all that, I'm just going to say that. But what Krishna is telling us is that as the age ascends, the necessity for all those rituals in that way of attuning to the world will become less and less important until finally it will fall away. As I said in class 12, this is an important understanding, because otherwise we don't capture the fact that what Yogananda is bringing here is not merely one more Vedic tradition. he's bringing a spiritual revolution. And there are times in the course of this planet, which again I talked about this in class 12, when things really shift. And my challenge when I have been teaching these teachings in India is that there is such a strong commitment to the past, and of course a less of an ability to imagine a future when nothing supports it except the declaration of the masters. And of course, having the faith and hearing. Faith is one thing, and the second is comprehension. So what I received as a question after that, actually before I do that, I had made a reference in, I believe in class 12 and even in class 13, to a few things that Master had written that are not included in the Gita commentary. And I actually went to find them, and I thought they were worth bringing up. Here is a very interesting book. I'm going to hold it up. It's called A World in Transition, Finding Spiritual Security in Times of Change. And it's excerpts from talks by Paramhansa Yogananda and other of his disciples, Dayamata, Taramata, Mrinalini, Brother Anandamoy. This book is not published by Ananda. This book is published by Self-Realization Fellowship. In fact, it's not in print. They don't continue to publish it, but you can go onto Amazon and other sources and find it. And it's a very interesting book. It was published at the end of the 90s, just before the millennia. And there's just a couple of lines in here that I would really like to quote that are extremely interesting. Let me just see what, this is the main one that I wanted to quote. Master says that everything that has happened throughout the ages is recorded in the ether. The vibrations of evil that mankind leaves in the ether upset the normal harmonious balance of the earth. When the earth becomes very heavy with disease and evil, these etheric disturbances cause the world to give way to earthquakes, floods, and other natural disasters. And he referred in that case to the partial dissolution of a planet. And he referred to the flood of Noah, which of course is an ancient biblical event, but Master said it was simply an example of when the vibrations of mankind on earth become too disharmonious and earth has to respond. Now here is one that's even more explicit. This was a talk Master gave in 1937, and it was published later in the Self-Realization Fellowship magazine in the summer of 1996. And it refers to current events of 1937, which is after the First World War had ended, before the Second World War began, and there was a war going on in Ethiopia. I think Italy had invaded Ethiopia in 1936. But the specifics are less the issue than the explanation. So it's a page here, and I'll read it for you. Why do world suffering and world misery arise? When people all over the earth are happy and prosperous, they are in tune with God, and the entire vibrations of the earth in relation with the planets are harmonious. But as soon as one nation starts fighting with another, or selfish industrial gourmands try to devour all prosperity for themselves, Master was always so colorful in the way he said things, it brings depression. And when depression starts in one place, it begins to spread everywhere, owing to the vibrations that travel through the ether. Isn't that interesting? People think it's because the world markets are interconnected. And of course, the world markets may be interconnected, but Master gives the cause first to the vibrations that travel through the ether, and then it sets up conditions that cause other economic systems or social systems also to aberrate. The last World War, which was World War I, created wrong vibrations in Europe first, which then spread all over the earth. And where there was no war, influenza appeared. The agonies of the people who died in the World War were the subtle cause of the epidemic of Spanish flu, which immediately followed the war and killed 20 million people, while the war itself only killed 10 million. In the present Spanish Civil War, vibrations of the death struggles of thousands of men, women, and children are floating in the ether, causing floods in America, storms in England and Portugal, and earthquakes in India. And so the peoples of the world, instead of creating more conflicts and getting into wars, should try their utmost to use peaceful means and non-cooperation to stop war. And then he says the murder of thousands of Ethiopians who didn't want the war and the vibrations of injustice done to them has upset the equilibrium of the world. For no one can get away with disturbing one part of the world without the disturbance moving through the ether waves to other parts of the earth. If people in one part of the house are disturbed, then the whole household is bound to be disturbed. After the Ethiopian conquest, the dread of war left as an aftermath of the last world war vanished. Many nations are again enthused for wars of aggression. So, we're certainly finding ourselves in exactly the same position. Now, I'm not reading something like that to scare us. I was going to say scare us to death, because death is really what we're thinking about here. But just because Master said it, he didn't mince words. He wasn't afraid to state things categorically. But what he's really trying to do, well, one, he was really trying to wake up planet Earth and to get mankind as a whole to understand where we are. Because where we are, as I explained in class number 12, and this is why I spent a whole class talking about the yugas and trying to explain Sri Yukteswar's explanation of where we are in the yuga cycle, is we are in an ascending age. And being in an ascending age, those people who have any awareness of what the possibilities of this age are and what the actual interrelationship of conditions of the world are, we have a very serious responsibility. And this is an enormous incentive for Master's work in this world and Swami Kriyananda's work in this world, is that this being a transition between Kali Yuga ascending and Dwapara Yuga ascending, it's time to set an entirely new model. And the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Krishna have been in existence all through Kali Yuga descending and Kali Yuga rising, but now they're being reinterpreted. They're not different teachings. It's always, the masters always had the same complete teaching, but when the age shifts, people can understand things differently. The master himself has infinite consciousness and is free from all limiting conditions, but once he takes an incarnation, he can only communicate with the civilization and the culture he's in a way that that civilization and culture can accept, or I should say, and lay a foundation that future more enlightened ages will understand, or individual souls of greater realization will be able to intuit and draw from that. So that's exactly what Master is doing for us now. So by describing how all-pervasively detrimental these bad thoughts and bad actions are, Master is trying to awaken a sense of responsibility in all of us who have the ears to hear. If this were Kali Yuga descending, as it were when Jesus, right after Jesus died, those who were serious about their spiritual life just turned their back completely on the world. The tradition of the Desert Fathers, as I explained, where they just went off and got as far away as they could from civilization. There was no point in even trying. There was no point in planting a work, building an organization, trying to set a foundation that would grow and expand, because things were bad and things were going to get worse. And all the traces were just wiped out by the barbarians at the nadir of Kali Yuga. St. Anthony went and meditated for decades in absolute solitude. There was just no point in not doing that. he did come out at the end of his life and give great hope to persecuted Christians. But nonetheless, nobody was trying to build anything. And Master is trying to build. And somebody asked me a question. I was in Los Angeles over the weekend just past, and someone asked me a question. What's the best way to get in tune with the Master? And of course, it's a very good question. And I stopped for a moment and thought, and I said, service. And service to the cause for which the Master incarnated, and the cause to which Swami Kriyananda gave his life. And that cause was awakening receptive souls to the possibility of God communion, and as an extension of that, the possibility of harmony with everything. As Master writes here, when people all over the earth are happy and prosperous, they are in tune with God, and the entire vibrations of the earth in relation with the planets are harmonious, and these difficult conditions simply don't exist. So the way that the Vedas in the descending age wanted us to remain harmonious was by formalizing our relationships and setting up rituals that before everything was done. I'm talking to many of you in India, but those who are not of the Indian culture may not appreciate it to the extent that some of us do. A friend of mine who bought a flat near Delhi. Yeah, the custom at that time, maybe it still, was not. In America, you borrow all the money to buy your home, and then you move into your home and you live in it and you pay it off for the next so many decades. The Indian system, when my friend was buying, is the apartment had to be completely paid off before he could take possession of it. So after all that effort, and he was finally able to take possession of it, he still couldn't move in until the astrologically auspicious time, which was like 5.5 months after he had finished purchasing it. So it just had to sit there empty for 5.5 months, because the Vedas dictated that everything in life must be done in harmony with greater realities, and that principle is absolutely valid. So the astrologers cast the moment, this is the time for you to shift your dwelling place. And then, of course, in order to dedicate the new flat so that it would be a place of health and harmony for the family, and that everything would work and the building would not be destroyed by fire, flood, or famine. Well, I guess buildings can't be destroyed by famine, but people can be. It was necessary to do the appropriate rituals, to set the vibrations exactly right, and which involved building a fire in the central living room of the place and breaking coconuts, which meant that after all of that was done, the place had to be cleaned up and repainted. Now, this was just business as usual as far as my Indian friend was concerned, but of course all us Americans who have no rituals of any kind like that, we found it both distressing and amusing. I far prefer the Vedic rituals than the absolute ignorance of the necessity to be in tune, which is what characterizes the American culture. But there's another alternative, which is a better one still, and this is what Krishna was referring to when he says to the man of realization, you don't need the Vedas anymore. Meaning, what the point of the Vedas is for us to have a conscious attunement with the greater reality, and to recognize that everything is interrelated. And one person's actions ripples out. And if we think that casually we can have nefarious thoughts and selfish actions and cruel and inconsiderate decisions, and think that no one is affected, it's just simply not true. All those vibrations go out into the ether. Now, of course, genocide is far worse than just being inconsiderate to your spouse, but it's all on the same wire. And it's either in tune with divine law or it's moving away from divine law. So the question that I received in response to last week's program was simply saying, if the propitiatory Oh, and there was one more point that was important. Swamiji says, however, as the age declined and the rituals were remembered and still practiced, but the clarity of the right relationship between the consciousness of man and of all the other beings was lost as the planet darkened. The relationship became one more of propitiating. That here's the all-powerful nature spirit, and I'm going to try to please that nature spirit and get him to do what I want. And not only is this less elevated than simply realizing that we're all working in harmony for the greater good, Swami adds the interesting point that these nature spirits, these devas, these angelic beings who are in charge of the rain and the weather and so on, are not free souls. They're just more advanced souls. He said, but they also have egos. And if they become too self-important about their own power, then that slight dissonance is also set up. So he was saying that a propitiatory attitude, oh, please, please, I'll give you this, I'll give you all this money, I'll give you all this ritual, I'll honor you in all these ways, I'll bow to you as all-powerful, he said also does not, in the end, bring about the ideal result. And so this is Master trying to correct aberrations that have set in. It's not that the original teachings were not crystal clear and true, it's just after so many ages, and that's why the Gita says in a later verse, whenever virtue declines and vice gains an upper hand, then the infinite spirit, I take visible form in order to correct that. And it's often a challenge for those who are committed to the form of truth that they are accustomed to recognize when a new revelation has come, and to understand how to integrate that revelation into present life, which is actually why, although the revelation of self-realization that Master brought came from India, and he was born in India, he had to start it in America. Because America, in terms of this kind of teaching, was a clean slate, virtually. And so in India, even now, as Ananda's work is going back into the country of India, the place of its birth, the struggle is a little different to try to make it clear that yes, this grows out of the ancient tradition of India. This is completely orthodox to the ancient tradition of India, but orthodox to a different dimension of it than all of the ways of worship, is how Swami described it. The external ways of worship compared to the internal ways of awakening. Master is trying to bring back the internal ways of awakening, and the ways of worship are not really the point. And to understand that distinction in the Indian culture, where the distinction has not been obvious for a long time, is the challenge of self-realization in India. The movement of self-realization as Swami Kriyananda, Paramhansa Yogananda, Lahiri Mahashaya Babaji are trying to bring it. There's a tradition, I think it's a Christian saint who actually articulated it. And he said, it's not enough to relate to the ancient sages. One must also relate to the realized soul most recent in time, because they're the ones who are bringing the message for the present moment. Which is, actually, I haven't quite finished this, but that was another question that was asked me, I also received during this past week over the email, was just how is this Christianity? Why is it that Master interprets the Bible so differently than those authorities who speak for the Bible? Many years ago, in the town where we have our temple now in Palo Alto, before we had the temple we have now, which is a very beautiful building with a large sanctuary where many things are possible because of the space and the high ceiling nature of that room and the size of the dais and so on. But before we inhabited this building, when we wanted to have a major celebration, we would have to rent somebody else's building. And there was a Christian church in town that had a large hall that they didn't use all the time, so we rented it for a celebration of Yogananda's birthday one year, and it was very suitable. And so the next year I came and spoke to the minister again and asked if we could rent it again. Somewhere in between, he'd learned a little bit more about us, the minister, and he was a little bit disinclined to rent to us. So, but first he was asking me a little bit about the teachings we represent. And I said that Master taught from both the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, and especially he taught from the New Testament. And the minister sort of pulled himself up with this pride of possession, and he said, "I hope he doesn't presume to call himself a Christian," he said like that. And I pulled myself up and looked him right in the eye, and I said, "He most certainly does. But he takes his relationship with Jesus directly from Jesus. He does not take it through the churches that have been founded in Jesus' name in the centuries since." Well, as you can well imagine, he did not rent us his church. But still, he hope he does not presume to call himself a Christian. You know, where did the possession of Christianity come from? An institution claims it because nobody is disputing it, but that doesn't mean that God and Guru agree with that interpretation. And it's not as if, you know, subsequent centuries of sincere, in their own way, seekers really intend to change the teaching from its original. They do the best they can do, but they understand it according to their own thinking. In fact, a highly educated Christian clergyman actually explained to me that the explanation given by his denomination was that the full teachings of Jesus were not revealed by Jesus himself, but only over the next several hundred years did those teachings really come into focus. Meaning that as the church was formed and as the institution got its dogmas in place, that was the real teaching of Jesus, and it took time before that could happen. I thought that was hysterically funny. And the man who was telling it to me was not only a highly trained Christian clergyman, highly trained intellectually, but he was also a devotee of our path and a Kriyaban. But he was, you know, he didn't hear himself. He didn't hear what he was saying. So I said, so what you're actually saying is a self-realized master, an avatar, a full being of infinite consciousness, does not really understand the nature of truth and reality and self-realization, but generations of priests who have no such state of consciousness themselves are required to explain it. And of course, that's ludicrous. What they did was change it. They changed it into something that worked better for their institution. And that's not evil. That's just what happens. When Yogananda had his incarnation as William the Conqueror, one of the reasons that he incarnated was to support the Catholic Church and to bring Christianity into the island of Britain and push away the pagan religion that was being brought there. And as Yogananda as William and Swami Kriyananda as his son Henry greatly supported the church. And Lanfranc, who was a very important archbishop, was Sri Yukteswar himself. And so they did what they could to strengthen the Catholic Church, because it was still, for the time, the truest and the best expression. And they held to it. But only later, as Kali Yuga finished, Kali Yuga ascending finished, and we came into Dwapara, Yogananda comes back. And this time, he's not supporting the Catholic Church. This time, he's supporting the revelations of Jesus. Now, to come all the way back to the question that I have in front of me, still, which is, she says, if propitiating the nature spirits is not appropriate for the current age, she said, and I don't have the power to end the wars in the Middle East or anywhere else, what can I do? And of course, that's the obvious question, isn't it? And the answer is not, the answer is obvious in a very real sense. And but we have to feel it on the deepest level of our own selves. Swami Kriyananda actually took the necessity to be in tune and harmonize with Mother Earth much more than was obvious, if you think about it for a moment. Very early on, in the early 60s, he wrote an anthem for the ecology movement. It's never actually been sung or taken up as much as he would have liked it to be, but some of the words were very simple. This earth was given to us to protect and to serve, and to expand and to enjoy the fruitfulness of it, but it is not ours to destroy. And that's basically the first understanding. And then many of Swami Kriyananda's songs are all images of nature and enjoyment of nature and the joy of nature and the sunset and the sea. And Yogananda's Whispers from Eternity, it's just rife with examples taken from the natural world. Now, this is the key that they both put forward, is we don't worship Mother Nature. We don't worship divine forces, but we see in the created world the manifestation of the divine behind it. And we see in the created world, it's really the communication of the divine with us. It's communicating through symbols. And that's how we elevate our consciousness. We understand symbolic communication is often more profound than mere verbal communication, because verbal is one step removed. It becomes conceptual and intellectual, and we have to try to understand what the meaning of those sounds are, and they mean different things to different people. But the sight of the ocean, for example, just is in of itself. It communicates this tremendous moving force, and yes, still there's a certain subjective interpretation of it. But the mere presence of the ocean on the planet is one way of God awakening us to the infinite, expanding possibilities and the ever-changing movement of the waves. And the ocean remains the same, but the waves on the surface are ever dancing and shifting, or whipped up by the winds, or calmly reflecting the light of the sun. All of these, you see, are magnificent spiritual images. And when we relate to the natural world in its largest and smallest aspects, what we need to, our response is one of gratitude, but not personifying the ocean as a deity that we have to propitiate so that he won't flood our lands, but the personification of the ocean as a symbol and a sign of the great beauty and the infinite power of the divine. So it's always God on the other side of it that we love. Swami Kriyananda also wrote a song, which is another anthem for attunement with the world around us. It's called Channels, and in it he celebrates, it's like 6 different aspects of nature: the stars, the rivers, the trees, the mountains, the flowers, the birds. And each one, I won't sing or even say all of it, but a few examples. Trees standing firm, hold the secret of inner power. Give us, when tested, strength to endure. And then the chorus of the song, Mother, meaning Divine Mother. Mother, we thank you. Your joy shines in everything. Open these channels, meaning ourselves and the divine form we're celebrating. Open these channels that the world once more may sing. Stars send a message of light through eternity. Lord, when in darkness, thy radiance we see. So we take the image of the stars and then we elevate it even one more dimension and look through it and see what's beyond it. You see how sweet that is? Now, that is relating to the natural world as you asked, but the rest of it is quite simply never underestimate the power of your own consciousness and the power of your own thoughts, not only to change your own destiny and your own karma, but also to be this radiating force out into the universe. Recently I was speaking of just the state of the world right now and where we are and what we're going to do, and it's my common sense belief that the forces of dissonance are so great right now that it is in the divine plan that there will be something that looks cataclysmic. Yogananda himself, 60 years ago, was fiercely and dynamically warning the world, you don't know what a cataclysm is coming. And Swami Kriyananda, as a disciple, felt obligated to spread that message also, not one of fear, but just from, look what Yogananda says here about how the dissonant forces, and it's not gotten better, it's simply gotten worse. We're not in a world conflagration at the moment, or I would say we're not in one world conflagration, but the forces of greed and evil are rampant. But nonetheless, so also in a paradoxical way, you see, because this is the transition between a lower and a higher age, and that's often not smooth. The more we individually dedicate ourselves to uplifting our own consciousness and being instruments of that for others, the more the balance will eventually, the more we're laying the groundwork for the balance to be righted. There, I have another thought there. Let me think if I can remember it. Just a moment. Oh yes. What Master says also about this present transition, dire and unpleasant as it may look at this point, is that it's a transition to a higher age. It's not a final, certainly, or even a partial dissolution of the planet. It's just a transition into a higher age. And the whole point of the challenges that are coming is to awaken people to a more spiritual way of life. And he promises that the result of this, once the dust settles, is that mankind as a whole, and this is the disheartening and the heartening prediction he made, mankind sick to death of war and violence will usher in a period of peace and prosperity that will last for some hundreds of years, that has never been seen on this planet before. And so our responsibility as disciples of this Master, as devotees of Swamiji, as companions to these gurus in their mission, and this was the question, how can I best get in tune with these gurus? Well, you can live as they lived. And what was the definition of their life? It was to serve the cause of expanding self-realization in the world. What did Lahiri Mahashaya do as soon as he got that Kriya from Babaji? He began to practice, he began to emanate, and he began to share. And then when it advanced to the life of Yogananda, he left his home and dedicated himself to establishing the principles of self-realization in America. What did Swami Kriyananda do? He dedicated his entire life. One thing he was here to do, which was to serve his guru. That's how you get in tune. And the service of our guru at this time is the bringing forth of this new understanding of self-realization, which is orthodox to the true revelation of Krishna and of Jesus, but is not orthodox to the forms that have been laid on top of it, because this is a new age and that communion must be direct now. We have another question I'd like to answer before I go on.
May I want to repeat it? Why does Christianity as a religion try to dominate the world?
With
reference to conversions and...
Why does Christianity as a religion try to dominate the world? Why does anybody try to dominate the world? It's ego. Institutions have ego as much as individuals have ego. And in many ways, Swamiji has often said institutional ego is worse because you can feel that you're serving a cause. You know, the idea of Christians trying to convert everyone is actually less evil than it feels if you are the one trying to be converted. When Swami Kriyananda was expelled from SRF in 1962, at the time he was working in India. He was working for SRF in India, and he was summoned to New York, and then they told him that he was no longer a member of SRF and was no longer going to serve. And his first thought was that he could just go back to India and become a hermit somewhere. But SRF so arranged it that he couldn't get a visa back into India for 10 years before it was straightened out, which caused him to have to work in America and start Ananda. So it was all in the divine plan. But in his permanent record in the Home Office in India, there were 2 accusations leveled against Swami Kriyananda, which were sufficient to keep him out of the country for a decade until it could be worked out. The first was that he was actually a CIA agent, which of course was not a desirable thing. But the second was that he was a Christian missionary. He was accused of being a CIA agent and a Christian missionary, and was therefore absolutely not allowed back in India, because Indians were profoundly insulted, and rightly so, when people came in and tried to tell them that they didn't have the true religion. I mean, the irony of that is really extraordinary. I'll come back to this in just a moment. When you find out, as Master states unequivocally, that the so-called lost years of Jesus, from the age of 12 to 30, when he just disappeared from the Gospels and seemingly was nowhere at all, he actually traveled to India, and he studied in India and preached around India, and he was really a very orthodox follower of Sanatana Dharma, not of Hinduism per se, but of Sanatana Dharma, the true teachings. He sat at the feet of the Himalayan masters. Babaji himself was his guru and tutored him. And so then for the Christians to come back and try to say in the name of Jesus that their teaching is superior to what Jesus himself taught them, I think the masters must get a good laugh. However, because Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the light, and no one comes unto the Father except through me," and because over time, what is made crystal clear in the Bhagavad Gita, but it was that when a self-realized master uses the pronoun I, he is speaking I, my infinite consciousness, not I, the body that infinite consciousness is working through at the moment. But because Jesus came just as Kali Yuga was descending, and the perception of matter as the final reality became so rigidified on the planet, it literally became impossible for the followers of Jesus to even imagine, because you have to understand, in the West there's no continuous tradition. On the eastern side in India, because of the Vedas, there's a continuous tradition of spirituality, and the understanding that avatars come and there's many different masters, that's just completely imbued in the Indian soul. And when any master comes, he's seen in the context of all those who have come before. And that's how Krishna explains it. Whenever virtue declines and vice predominates, I, the infinite spirit, take human form. But in the West, there's no such tradition. And when Jesus said, I am the way, they just thought it had to be Jesus Christ. And they just believed that that was what he meant, and there was nothing and no one to correct him. Even the saints and there have been true saints, many of them, in the Christian tradition, because Jesus is a true master, so therefore his disciples can achieve what he achieved. Even they, because they have acted within the context of the representative of Jesus' teaching, which has been mostly the Catholic Church and more recently the Protestants, they don't always attack it directly, in the sense of they're not trying to pull the whole house down, because it was better to keep it intact than it was to destroy it. Only now, at this age, can it be changed. So the world domination, in its best form, and I read a very interesting book. The Pearl S. Buck is an American woman who actually spent the first 40 years of her life in China, because her father, especially, was a dedicated Christian missionary. With a much sweeter and broader attitude than some, he completely immersed himself in the Chinese culture. He didn't hold himself apart from it or even superior to it. But his belief, and misguided perhaps, but absolutely sincere on his part, which gave him tremendous self-sacrificing power, was that, in fact, unless people accepted Jesus Christ and understood that I am the way, the truth, and the light, they would suffer for eternity in darkness. And he sacrificed all comfort, all pleasure, all self-aggrandizement for himself to just go out there and tell as many people as he could. He translated the Bible into many dialects, many Chinese dialects, and just did everything he could to save these people. Now, whether they needed to be saved or not is a completely other question, but he sincerely believed it. And as I say, it gave him great power. He disciplined himself deeply, and his idea was not to dominate, but to serve. However, not everyone who was doing that was as selfless and as true. But you need to judge a teaching by its most elevated expression first, and then you can see how it comes down. And then institutional ego sets in. We have the true teaching, and you are, and the literal word is heathens. It's so charming to me that everybody else thinks the other is a heathen. Yogananda laughs about that. The Christians call the Hindus heathens, and the heathens call the Christians. The Hindus call the Christians heathens. The Christians call the Hindus heathens. The Jews call everybody else a Gentile, and it's just everybody separates, and it's just ego. It's an ego, and I don't mean it like evil. Ego isn't evil. Ego just simply is. We believe ourselves to be separate from the whole, and we believe ourselves to be different from one another. And this is why Master says self-realization has come to unite all religions. And he didn't mean, oh my God, that self-realization is going to be the next world dominating force, and that self-realization fellowship or Ananda church of self-realization, is now going to be the one that gets to wipe out all the others and make them like us. No. What Master meant was when we understand the interior nature of all of this, and that the I that Jesus was talking about is actually the I within every one of us. It's not the external I of Jesus that we have to submit ourselves to and his church. It's the internal I of divinity. And the only way is that, with Jesus saying, I am the way, I means infinite consciousness, attunement of the individual self with the infinite self. That's the only way. That's the only way to freedom, to bliss, to fulfillment, to everything we want. And when Jesus said, walk as I have walked, he meant follow the path of self-realization. And then you will come as I have come into the state of oneness with God. That which I do, ye shall do, in greater things. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Yes, all of that has been misused in the name of ego. Ego is the infinite identified with something limited. The physical body, the cult with which that body is associated, the religion that is mine, but it's all the infinite identified with something limited. And it's highly unfortunate from the point of view of the ego, because it perpetuates delusion. But the other side of it, and this is again why 2 classes ago I spent the whole time, and apparently much of this one too, just talking about these evolutionary cycles on Earth, this progress of the yugas, is because the ego is not in charge. The purpose of this planet, we have this idea that the purpose of this planet is to make a comfortable place where we can just not be challenged, not be made uncomfortable, just nest down into something that just works for the consciousness we have right now, however we define it. But the purpose of physical incarnation is to gradually be able to see through Maya altogether, to realize that even though I identify and imagine myself to be all of these ephemeral realities that I am participating in fact, my true nature stands beyond and outside all of them. And one of the most powerful ways that lesson is learned is when the preferences of the ego are challenged, whether it's by flood, famine, fire, domination by an alien culture, spiritual teachings that in the end prove inadequate. Something challenges my ability just to settle down at my present level of consciousness. And sometimes we all incarnate at a time where there will be many things will happen, cataclysmic events, great external disharmony and insecurity. Early Dwapara, that's what this is apparently about. This is early Dwapara. And in early Dwapara, lots of tough things happen. Master, in the World in Transition book that I read from earlier, in the very essay that I was reading from, he has many comments about, well, his essential words are, the age that we're living in now, we begin to develop enough power to really cause problems on the planet, but we haven't developed equal moral power to know what to do with all these forces that we're learning how to use, atomic energy, electrical energy, just all the forces that we can bring to bear. We're not using them for the upliftment of mankind. We're using it for domination. And for a person of elevated consciousness, it's utterly incomprehensible. But this is the point I was going to make. Even people of goodwill right now, it's such a confusing element, and it actually either leads you to atheism or to deeper faith in God. Which is, why is it? Let's use the Mideast as an example. I was listening to a biography of a man who's a journalist in the Mideast, now, present time. He's an Israeli man who lives there with his family. And at the same time, as a journalist, he has many contacts on the Palestinian side of the conflict. And he literally has visited the homes of the Palestinian jihadists, I guess would be the word I would use, who are making bombs. And there's this journalist objectivity where you just try to understand both sides of the story. And the journalist describes this chaos of a dilemma for himself, because the bombs that some of these young men are making may in fact end up killing his own children, his own Israeli children. But he's entered into it enough that the humanity of all sides is there. And the other feature that he talked about is 80%, 90% of people on both sides of the conflict just want peace. But somehow there's this other force that is not allowing that peace to happen right now. So either we decide this world is insane and there's no God at all, or we decide that there's just something completely other playing itself out here. And this is what Master tells us. And he tells it to us in countless different ways for us to really try to grasp this. And in the Bhagavad Gita, I haven't gotten to the verses that I was about to read. To a man of wisdom, there's no fear. There's no anxiety about what's going on in the world. There's no discontent about what's going on. You're not subject to the up and down conditions of the world around you. The Gita goes on and on for many verses, and starting in our next class, we'll just start there. What does the man of wisdom look like? And the man of wisdom, and I will explain it in more detail, it's not that he's uncaring. The masters feel our reality far more deeply than the average man does, and is utterly driven by compassion. What causes a divine, a free soul who has no karma of his own, he has no reason to come into this world, what causes him to accept the challenging conditions of human birth except pure compassion for the plight that we're in? And so on the planet now, the trouble in the Mideast, the drought in America, the dust storms in Arizona, the floods, the famines, everything that's going on, is that all of the souls who choose to incarnate at this time, each one of us has very carefully selected the exact conditions that will challenge our consciousness and give us the opportunity to move from being slaves to delusion, slaves to Maya, into that consciousness of the man of wisdom. How do you think the man of wisdom becomes calm in himself in the face of the ever-changing waves? By deeper and deeper penetration into the reality behind everything that's happened. And that's not something that you just pick up casually. That's something that you must earn by constantly facing into this. And for all of us, despite the fact that the ego still says, I want it comfortable, I don't want all these things to happen, for all of us, apparently, it was exactly what our souls wanted. When we were in the astral world, and as Master said, there's many planets that we can go to. We didn't have to choose Earth in early Dwapara, which is, Master said, an extremely insecure time to be incarnated. This is a very insecure time on this planet, on any planet, early Dwapara. But we wanted it. Because even though we say, oh, why aren't things just peaceful? Why aren't the children being fed? Why is it not happening? Somehow, this particular configuration was exactly what our souls need in order to move forward that next step, to overcome that next point of fear, that next concern that we're not quite up to the challenge, that next inclination to contract in the face of threat rather than expand. My friend asked me here, what can we do to attune ourselves if we're not supposed to propitiate? And she was talking about the natural world, but how do we solve the war in the Mideast? We solve the war in the Mideast by realizing that every minute of our life is a choice. By wherever we're standing, to expand our consciousness into a greater attunement, experience, self-offering, opening as a channel to the divine uplifting forces, which are also trying to express themselves on our planet. That's our job. Will it stop the wars, change the floods? Master said, not likely, not right away. But we are laying the foundation for what Master promises us will be the time when the planet itself will become more of what we can imagine that it could be. But that will only happen as Divine Mother wills it, as Divine Mother wishes it, in the way she organizes this school for the individual liberation of each one of us. God bless you.